today I want to confine myself purely to the Australian cash rate. So earlier this week, there was a survey published in the AFR, and one of the 29 people that was surveyed was me. And I find myself in the rather embarrassing position of now having gone through a couple of years of saying things that were completely outrageous about interest rates, that now I find I'm saying things that are pretty much in the middle of the pack. My view is that there will be a cut in cash rates, one cut this year in November. And amazingly, that was the most popular forecast. 9 out of 29 people suggested that was the case. And I think there will be 2 more cuts next year. And the number I come up with for the cash rate of the end of next year of 335 basis points was also pretty much in the middle of the pack. Matter of fact, it was halfway between the number 1 rated guy and the number 2 rated person. The numbers they came up with, the 2 people that were rated most highly in the survey earlier in the year. So having said that, now my outlook is completely ordinary and similar to everybody else, I'd like to talk about how I got there and what I think are the things to look for, and in particular, what is the particular number that you have to look at. Now, back in the day, in that mythical period called back in the day, I developed a short rate model in which there were a lot of things in the model, but the most important thing was inflation. And the most important part of that inflation was its core inflation, not headline inflation. And I continued running a model of the Australian cash rate like that pretty successfully, and wasn't thinking to change it until I went to a presentation by a particular presentation in 2016 in San Francisco, who was given by the guy who was then the deputy head of the US Federal Reserve. His name was Stan Fisher. And Stan Fisher had previously to being deputy head of the Federal Reserve, he had been head of the Reserve Bank of Israel. And what he introduced to me in his presentation was the idea that, sure, inflation is really important for where interest rates are now, but what the central banks have got to do is not make decisions about where interest rates are now, but where interest rates are going to be in the future. And what I learned from Stan Fisher was that in deciding where interest rates were going to be in the future, and inflation, where Feds thought that inflation was going to be in the future, what they looked at increasingly was the effect of unemployment. Because when you're in a services economy, the lower unemployment is, the higher wages growth is in the services sector, and that pushes up services prices. And the reason that's important, because countries like the United States and Australia are manufacturing countries the way they were some decades ago, but are primarily service-driven economies. And so when I came home, I updated my model to include unemployment. And at that time, the RBA, not the RBA, but the ABS had introduced a more stable measure of unemployment, and that's the trend measure of unemployment. And so I put the trend measure of unemployment in my model, and I found, to my considerable amazement, that it was far better at variations in the trend measure of unemployment. It was far better at forecasting what central banks were going to do than where inflation was. So that if unemployment was falling, then central banks, including the RBA, started to tighten rates. And if unemployment was rising, central banks, including the RBA, would cut rates. And including that in my model and updating that model today, that model still explains 89.5% of monthly variation of the Australian cash rate over the last 30 years. But increasingly what's happening when I look at that model now, unemployment is more important in determining what the RBA is going to do in the future than where inflation is. Okay. So when I update that model this morning, which I did, I get an equilibrium level of the Australian cash rate of 4.22%, and which is just below where it is at 4.35. Statistically, there's very little difference. It's almost an infinitely small difference between where the cash rate is now and where the model says it should be. And that model leads by about 6 months, maybe a touch longer. And that suggests that, we'll probably have a rate cut at the end of the year if we squeeze it in. But what's really important to watch in terms of what the Federal Reserve what the RBA is going to do is what happens to unemployment.
When I look at the quarterly statement on monetary policy,
which the RBA now publishes 4 times a year, it last published it in February. It has rates falling over the next couple of years, but it has significant increases in unemployment. The trend measure of unemployment right now is 3.8%, but the RBA has unemployment getting up to levels by the end of the next year and the year after of 4.5%. So we've about 2 weeks ago, I did a talk on the ABC radio about what had happened in interest rate expectations in Australia, with short variations happening in seasonally adjusted unemployment. And I pointed out then that it's the trend measure that we need to look at. So right now, in terms of our model, I am forecasting a rate cut at the end of the year, but that's because I expect unemployment, the economy will slow and unemployment will start to rise. As it gradually rises through this year and next year, what you will see is cuts in the Australian cash rate. I think that by the end of next year, the Australian cash rate will fall to 3.35%. And in doing that, I find myself exactly halfway between the 2 best estimators as rated early in the year. But at that time, as that happens, what we are going to see is unemployment rise from the current level of 3.8% to 4% and be moving to higher levels.